Good morning, good very early morning and good afternoon. Welcome to our session, European Memory and Politics, a Crisis of What? This is the only hybrid session that we have organized within the MSA conference. And the hosts of it are MSA, of course, and the European Network Remembrance and Solidarity, and Collegium Civitas. And we are sitting in a conference room at Zielna Street in Warsaw. The conference room is called Warszawa, Warsaw. And we have one of our guests here, Marek Cichocki, and then the other guest, Ivan Krastev, will be speaking to us from the countryside in Bulgaria. We have also a few guests, real people in the audience, and we are very happy to have you here. Thank you very much for your courage to come. The session is taking place within the genealogies of memory thematic track in the conference. Let me introduce our speakers now. Marek Cichocki, philosopher, political scientist, and historian of political thought. Professor at Collegium Civitas in Warsaw and visiting professor at College of Europe in Natolin. Between 1998 and 2015, he was assistant professor at Warsaw University. He was program director at the Center for International Relations at the Natolin European Center. He is editor-in-chief of the New Europe Natolin Review, as well as the co-founder of the yearly Teologia Polityczna, Political Theology. Between 2007 and 2010, he was advisor to the former president of Poland, Lech Kaczyński, and the Polish negotiator of the European Union Lisbon Treaty. His expertise focuses on the history of political ideas, especially the conservative thought and its current reception, and current socio-political matters, especially international relations, with focus on Polish-German relations. Sorry for my lapsus. His publications include Ciągłość i zmiana, czy konserwatyzm może nie być rewolucyjny, Continuity and Change, Can Conservatism Not Be Revolutionary, Porwanie Europy, The Kidnap of Europe, Władza i pamięć o politycznej funkcji historii, Power and Memory about the Political Function of History, Problem politycznej jedności w Europie, The Problem of Political Unity in Europe, and most recently, the North and South, the text about Polish culture and history, for which in 2019 he got the Józef Mackiewicz Literary Award. In this book, he explores long-term ideological roots of Polish culture and identity by trying to reformulate its defining relation with East and West towards an alternative axis, North and South, going back to the Roman Empire, and with this indicating the forgotten, I will rephrase, Christian heritage of Europe. Welcome, Professor Cichocki.
Thank you very much for this comprehensive introduction.
And our next speaker, Ivan Krastev, is political scientist and philosopher, chairman of the Center for Liberal Strategies in Sofia, and an independent think tank, which is dealing with in-depth research on political, social, and economic affairs in Bulgaria and globally. He's permanent fellow at the Institute of Human Sciences in Vienna in 2013, 14, and 17. He was Richard von Weizsäcker Fellow at the Robert Bosch Foundation in Berlin. He is founding board member of the pan-European think tank European Council on Foreign Relations, as well as a member of the board of trustees of the International Crisis Group. He was editor-in-chief of the Bulgarian edition of Foreign Policy and is contributing publicist in the New York Times. In 2004-2006, he was executive director of the International Commission on the Balkans, chaired by the former Italian Prime Minister Giuliano Amato. His publications include In Mistrust We Trust, Can Democracy Survive When We Don't Trust Our Leaders? Democracy Disrupted the Global Politics on Protest. After Europe, The Light That Failed, A Reckoning, co-authored with Stephen Holmes. And most recently, Is It Tomorrow Yet? Paradoxes of the Pandemic. In After Europe, he ponders over crisis of Europe and liberal democracy from the perspective of Europeans and the global power shifts among which they found themselves. And in The Light That Failed, he and Stephen Holmes pose the imitation imperative thesis to reinterpret the post-Cold War democratization and transnationalization processes and the following backlash towards particularism. Welcome, Ivan. Good to have you here. Both our speakers come from the area of political science and philosophy of politics. Both are not only scholars, but also public intellectuals. Both are Central and East Europeans concerned about Europe. Yet representing different ideological viewpoints, liberal or conservative. Today, I would like to invite you to listen to the dual voice of concern about European memory and politics. And I will ask our guests 3 questions, asking them to elaborate for a few minutes on each of them. After that, there will be time for discussion and ad vocem and for your questions and the questions from our audience here. If you are watching us online, you may send your questions via the website chat or Q&A function, or also leaving your comments on Facebook and YouTube. Are we witnessing a major historical change today? Is our history, memory, anxiety justified or overstated? How does history scare us, and can it inspire us as well? Is this a redefining moment for Europe? Are all voices heard in the debate? So my first question to the speakers will refer directly to the title of the session, European Memory and Politics, a Crisis of What? The feeling of experiencing a crisis is omnipresent in the current day's political discourse, public and also academic discourse. Crisis appears not merely in the context of European economy, but also politics and social and cultural issues. So what do we mean by crisis? Does one group's crisis refers to the same set of occurrences as the crisis of another group? So my question to you is, if today is the time of crisis, a crisis of what values, social, political, cultural, is, in your view, the most tangible, alarming one? Can history and memory be helpful in overcoming it? If yes, what past events or phenomena may serve as useful analogies, and if not, why? And I would like to ask first Ivan Krastev. The floor is yours now.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity. And I'm really envying you that you're going to talk to each other, not through the screen. And listen, part of the definition of modernity is that modern man all the time has the feeling that we are living in crisis. It's, of course, different from different periods, but I do believe we're going to be fair to say that this sense, not simply of crisis, that we're living in a certain type of a turning point, is a shared experience. Different people with a very different perspective are going to agree that probably we have reached a certain limits, and our definition of man, our definition of society is going to be different. And I'm just going to give you 4 dimensions of this. One is a very dramatically changed relations between man and nature. And if you go in all this story of a climate debate, nevertheless, where you stay on this debate, you're going to see that there is no border anymore between kind of a natural disaster and human-induced tragedy. In a certain way, this relationship, which before was very much perceived differently, is experienced. And this is not on the level of simply intellectuals, it's not on the level of experts. This is an everyday experience of everybody. The second is the technology story. Even what we see today, for the last 1 year, there was a period in which people cannot cross from one side of the street to another, but at the same time, basically, you are able to communicate with people in different corners of the world. This is a major change. Technology is changing the way we're seeing the world. And we're now talking just about communication technologies, but imagine all the talk about gene editing. So strangely, we're basically living in a world, I'm going to borrow the title of famous Soviet science fiction writers from the 1970s, Strugatsky's brothers, which was called "It is Not Easy to Be a God." So in a certain way, the modern man, the individual, basically start to face the problems and moral issues that we never had before. Do we have the ethical right basically to edit human gene in order to prevent certain type of diseases and so on? And of course, I do believe from this point of view, even this common experience of the pandemic was a kind of a sign of something which is deeper, because this is something that happened to the world almost at the same time, everywhere. And this is experience, personal experience. It's not about reflections. You're living this. Suddenly you understand that you're living in this very different world in which you can be infected by something that comes from the other part of the world. On the other side, you had the vaccines just several months after all this started. I believe this sense of novelty is very much there. And also there is a certain fear of the future. I remember that it was in the summer of 2019 when the Bertelsmann Foundation made a pan-European survey asking the question, when the life was better. Majority of Europeans in every single country is going to basically agree that the life was better before. We're not going to agree when this before was, and I do believe for different individuals and for different nations, this before is a very different time. But there is this fear of the future in something that I found quite important. And this is one of the reasons that we start basically totally differently, also talk about the past and the memory. And Marek is much more of a historian of ideas than me, and I'm sure that he was reflected deeper on this. But there's three things that I want to point as answering to your questions. In one of the last years of his life, the British-American historian Tony Judd made a point which I found very relevant to what we see in Europe today. He said, in Europe, we're not learning history anymore. We're learning the lessons of history. And I find this quite important because history is also the ability to try to see the world from the perspective of somebody that has been living in a totally different time, living in a totally different conditions, basically being made up for a totally different world. And while we talk a lot about past, we talk about memories, we basically became very sensitive about how past is going to be framed or not. I do believe we kind of lost the interest to talk to the dead. We are so kind of intensively communicating with each other that basically we lost the interest to live to the dead. And if some of the projections are right, today in the world there are living more people than people that have been ever living before in history. So probably this kind of overpopulation is one of the explanations why we're doing this. Why I'm saying this? I'm saying this because when Fukuyama came with the idea of the end of history, his major argument was that in a certain way history has reached a final point. But strangely enough, when you talk about the end of history now, you have the feeling that history does not matter anymore as history. And one of the things that strikes me in a different places, be it the current debates in the United States, do it in things that we see in Europe, is that we try to treat all historical figures as our contemporaries. We are judging them as if they are living next to us. And I find this kind of quite important in our understanding of how memory works. Here, and this is my last point, the problem is how politically to think about history. As I said, I'm not a historian. Obviously, the past is something that is very much polarizing and always can be politically used. And I found one of the definitions that come from Benjamin extremely important. So it was just one of the last things that Walter Benjamin did before he committed a suicide on the French-Spanish border in 1940, when he said, to articulate the past historically does not mean to recognize it as it is in a way it really was. It means to seize hold of it as a memory and the way it is flashes up to the moment of danger. And here comes your talk about analogies. Strangely enough, basically for us, the history became a reservoir of analogies. Because we don't have a really feeling about the time in which we're living, we're asking it as historical questions. Are we back in the 1930s? And all this talk basically talk about fascism, fears about fascism. You're going to see a lot of talks about this. Or are we living in the 1970s? Mm. The crisis of liberal democracy was very much up there. There was the idea of the major transformation. And I'm just talking about the 20th century. But many people are going to go back and basically find other periods. So this, in my view, is interesting about our understanding of the past. The past is very relevant, but it is relevant in the way what kind of analogy we are going to use. And as a result of it, some of the major divide between different political positions, between different political tribes in our politics is that people had the feeling that they're living in a different past periods. People who believe that we're back in the 1930s, they're going to react totally different to certain things that they see compared with the people, for example, who believe that they're living in the 1970s. And for me, this is part of the interesting political debate. And of course, this also has its reflections in the way the governments reflect. We have all these memory laws that you're going to see all over the places. Because the really last point what I want to make is that it is not simply about memory and history. This is how we feel about it. Mm-hmm. So from this point of view, the historical facts and the classical historical work suddenly lost its importance for politics. It's very much how basically using the history as a way to make a claim or protect people from feelings that they don't want to experience. And you can, by the way, see it both on the left and on the right. You can see it with a certain type of a memory laws that are coming in certain countries. You can see it in some of the universities where basically they're a different way of protecting the feelings of the students about this and that. But in my view, this is a very important dividing line. Is it about history or memory? And I'm going to end up saying that, strangely enough, the past very much comes as memory, not as a history. And memories of particular groups and also protecting certain memories and empowering certain memories. And probably this is one of the feeling of a crisis in which the question, who are we, is very much replaced the questions in which time we are living.
Thank you very much. This was very interesting, insightful. We can all refer our experience of every day to what you said. You said about the nostalgia for before, that we experience some kind of nostalgia for before, and you speak in terms about our feelings of history in terms of affects more than rationality, but at the same time you're saying that we are actually very practical about the past. We don't value it in itself, we are using it when it is convenient to us. Thank you very much. And now Marek Cichocki, please, the floor is yours for the same question.
The same question. So yes, I think I jump on this question, this general question you have posed. Crisis of what? Because I think it is a central problem how we respond to this question. What is really going on? What is changing? What is the center of the changes we are witnessing? And my answer would be, this is what we are witnessing now is a crisis of the liberal Western post-war order as a global frame. I want to be understood correctly. It doesn't mean that I think that liberal West can disappear. This is not my guess. What we are witnessing is a crisis of a liberal Western post-war order concept as a global frame, And if we look at different examples now, if we look, for example, at the political change which take place in Israel now, is a very interesting example of the coupling from this concept of the liberal Western post-war order as a global frame. But we have another such examples of the coupling from that. Turkey is one vivid example. Russia, of course, is a very good example of that. Not mention China, which is the elephant in this room. But interesting is that also Europe and United States became the battlefield of these changes since at least 1 decade. And of course, now this development of change, of the decomposition of this liberal Western post-war order as a global frame accelerate also because of such events like pandemia, but also, of course, because of the previous chain of different crises from at least the last decade, financial crisis, migration crisis, Brexit, Trump, everything accelerates this development. So it seems to me, and that would be my thesis, that this change is rather not to stop. And this forces us to think about what comes next. But why this is important in the context of memory and history, which is the major topic of our discussion here, of course, because I think that this idea of the liberal Western post-war order as a global frame was very strongly linked to the certain idea which Ivan already has mentioned, the idea of the end of history, or if you like, of the arc of history, which was basically a liberal one idea. And now, when we come to memory and to history, the question is, if this change is not to stop, we are witnessing, if the decomposition is not to stop and something new is coming, which is still just looming, and we don't understand very well what is it, then of course it means that history, and that would be a little bit counter to what Ivan said, that history has begun again. But now, I think this is now ahead of us, the whole intellectual and political effort to understand what does it mean. Because by saying that history has begun again, doesn't mean that we are back to the history.
To the past.
To the past. No, it is not what I mean here. And of course, the paradox I see with the memory culture is that the whole concept of the memory culture, which was elaborated in last decades, And memory culture we are talking about, and we have plenty institutions and museums illustrating our understanding of the memory culture. This memory culture was also directly linked to the idea of the end of history.
Yes.
So if the end of history is now coming to its end and something new starts to looming ahead of us. So the question I see here, how to use this memory culture, whether this memory culture, which is the product of the idea of the end of the history, can fit to what is coming ahead of us. And this brings me to the conclusion that I think we have to learn again to understand, to use the past and to use history, to enhance our understanding what is ahead of us, and not in the terms of the lessons, but in terms of facilitating us to understand the future. I will give you just only one example what I mean by that. Agreeing on that technology and climate is now such a huge revolutionary issue, which will probably lead to new social conflicts, and maybe it will even lead to new military conflicts, even maybe wars, which we cannot exclude such a possibility. I think it would be very useful to study, for example, the consequences of the second industrial revolution, which took place at the turn of the 19th and the 20th century, which led to mass movements, mass conflicts, new kind of ideologies, clashes, and of course to the first great war. So my conclusion would be that this is not that past and history doesn't matter anymore. On contrary, we have tried to learn how to use it again. And I agree with Ivan on one point. We need for that. We have to solve the problem of the institutional framework in which the usage of history and of the past can happen, because in the past this was university. And I agree with Ivan that probably history and past was expelled from universities, from campuses. But it doesn't mean that we don't need institutions which enables us to reshape our usage of history and of the past, which is, as I stated, a very needed thing, especially in front of what is ahead of us.
Thank you very much. Again, very, very stimulating thoughts. You both are speaking about memory lessons. We were so concentrated on memory lessons from the past, from what already happened, and of course the Second World War and the Holocaust and then communism were these closest pasts to us from which we drew lessons. But now history has started again, as you said, and the question is whether these are the lessons that are most suitable to create the history we are living in. I would say it would be the test for the post-war Western liberal frame order, whether it can now use these lessons, these products of memory to shape the future the way it could prevent what it does not want to happen. Let's move now to another notion, populism. It happens, it appears in the discourse as well. The definitions of populism in political sciences are not that decided, not to mention what we mean by populism, using the word in politics and public discourse and also in academia. So I would like to ask about the role of populism in liberal democracies, in democracies today. And my next question to both speakers is, what is your definition of populism? Are the populist phenomena of the 21st century distinct from the past? What is the role of populism in the current memory politics, both at national and transnational level? And this time I will turn first to Marek Cichocki. The floor is yours.
So I should speak again.
Unless you prefer a moment of breath.
So I try to be brief. I'm a little bit confused because I'm not a good person to answer this question, because I don't like the whole talk about populism. Not because I would argue that populism doesn't exist, but I think populism is not a center problem. Is not a center problem. Surely it is not the cause of the problems. Mm-hmm. This is a symptom of the problems. And of course, and that is why I don't like be so focused on analyzing populism. And we have a long list of definitions what populism is. Certainly, of course, from the politological point of view, populism is a constant movement within democracies as a response to the real problem of the decomposition of the idea of the representation. So if you want such an politological definition from me, so that would be mine proposed definition. But as I said, I don't see populism as a central problem. Of course, if you look at the current crisis from the liberal position, you can see the word either as liberal, as illiberal, or you can see the word as a post-liberal. And openly speaking, I'm much more interested in this third option. So I think we have to start to pose the question, what does it mean post-liberal? Because what I stated at the beginning about the crisis of a certain model of the liberal Western post-war global order means that we are, and that would be my thesis, we are entering a post-liberal world. And we have to start to thinking, what does it mean? What are the consequences of this shift? And of course, I agree that this is not so simple to find out a good response to such a question. Why? Because partly I think Fukuyama was right. Also partly Fukuyama was right, because on the one hand, the world has achieved a certain level of universalism as the product of the modernization process started in the 18th century, the 19th century, 20th century. So the world has achieved a certain level of universalism, which is mostly represented by technology and by capitalism. So what enabled us to achieve this certain level of the end of history, and here Fukuyama was right in my opinion, is technology and the global capitalism. But it doesn't mean the end of history. It doesn't mean the end of history, because this achieved level of universalism now provoked new forces. And what we observe I gave the examples in Israel, in Turkey, in Russia, in China, but also in United States. Look, John Biden started to talk about Roosevelt. What does it mean if we revoke this from the past, this example? So I think this level of certain technological and economic universalism triggered new kind of forces. And I think we have to start to think what moves these forces. Some people start to use such a term of civilization states. And I think something is to the point. What we observe and what we sometimes call the fragmentarization of globalization is the rise of civilization states. United States, and that is why I think Biden used this resemblance to Roosevelt, face effort to establish itself again as a civilization state. China is an obvious example of the civilization state. I think Turkey is and Russia is doing the same. And now the political turn in Israel is another example where we are witnessing probably an attempt to establish a small but very efficient civilization state in the form of Israel. And now
we are speaking of state projects, right? They are
something more, because this is not about the national state. Civilization state is something more than just the simple traditional national state. Civilization state is a word for itself, using, of course, and controlling parts of this universal technology and universal economy. And my conclusion and my final question here, which brings us back to the problem of our past, of history and memory, is whether Europe will be capable of establish itself as a civilization state. Because this is the challenge for future. This is a challenge of future. We have two options, I think. Whether Europe will be capable to stand up to this competition, which is looming, and will try to afford to establish own European civilization state, or it will be just the sub-civilization to the United States as a
Western
transformed civilization state.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And now, Ivan Krastev, we are coming back to populism. You may turn in your direction as well, if you wish. So what is your definition of populism?
I will use it there. Listen, the definition's easy to be made, but it was Isaiah Berlin already back in the 1960s who said that populism is like the famous shrew of Cinderella, where you're basically having the concept and then try to find the feet that fit it. So let's start with the two things which I do believe with Marek were in a very important agreement. And this is the Cold War frame. Not simply the post-war, but in a certain way, the world that he framed as a clash between the free world and the communist world, this type of a frame was a global frame for a long period of time. And interestingly, what was important about the Cold War world, it was that it was a clash between two universalisms, and both of them had been rooted in the European Enlightenment. In a certain way, both the liberal democracy and communism had a claim that they know how the future is going to look like and that basically future belongs to them. And as a result of it, many other countries which didn't fit very easily into this frame, for example, you can imagine that newly born African states in the 1960s were not very eager to define themselves according to this line because of the constellation of power were very much pushed to do this. So this kind of a global frame is collapsing, and part of it is collapsing is because you have a new constellation of power also. And The post-Cold War was very much dominated by the United States and the West. Obviously, you have a new power centers. As a result of it, you're going to have a new narratives, and suddenly you realize that for many people, for example, decolonization and the narrative of decolonization is more important than the Cold War narrative. So part of this thing that you see within the United States is to what extent the decolonization narrative is basically replacing the Cold War narrative, also about what is an American identity. So on this, I do believe we're very much there. And where I also do believe we're very much there is that for sure populism is part of the democratic politics. It is anti-pluralist because it claims to represent real people. It is much more in the Schmittian understanding of politics of us versus them, but this is part of the democratic political discourse. And from this point of view, for me, populism is not interested as a characteristic of a certain parties or leaders. It's much more interesting in a general transformation of democratic politics in general. And here I'll try to come with a slightly more provocative approach of how we can distinguish, thinking to the future, the liberal conservative or liberal illiberal, or any way you try to put it, this position. And as you know, demography was quite central basically to the way I have been thinking about politics. And the demographic changes that the world is undergoing, and I mean particularly Western world, but to be honest, particularly Eastern Europe, is quite amazing. Because we're talking about democratic transition, but the demographic transition, which is very much about much lower fertility rates, much longer lives, but also shrinking of the population and depopulations are quite important. Compared with 1989, 18 million East Europeans are basically not living there. If this was a country, this country was going to be as big as Czech Republic and Hungary. Why this is important? Because if you remember in 1953, after the anti-communist protest in East Berlin, Bertolt Brecht came with a poem which was called Solution. And the satirical nature of the poem, he said, if the government is so much disappointed with the people, why they don't dissolve the people and elect a new one? I'm going to claim that at the center of the democratic politics which we see in many of the Western countries today is how governments are going to elect the people and what kind of people they're going to elect. Mm-hmm. And this is done through migration policies, basically to whom you're giving citizenship and why. When you're doing this, basically also how you're defining the idea of the national identity. It's also done through the electoral laws. And you're going to see this debate about who has the right to vote and who has the right to vote easily as very central to the United States. But this is critically important because two different ideas of majorities that have been kind of peacefully coexisting in European and American politics for the last 100 years now went in clash. If you go back to the origin of the European nation state, you're going to see that European nation state was created with a very clear idea of a permanent majority and permanent minorities. And they have been ethnically national in their culture. So you have minorities, but one of the reasons that minorities should be tolerated and they have rights in a nation state is that they are not threatening majority. They are not threatening basically the nature of the state. So at the same time, you have another majority, and this majority is the majority that is born every 4 years after people voting. And this majority does not have particularly ethnic or national character, particularly in a slightly more multi-ethnic societies. You can see minority parties being part of it. And of course, this was a major issue. If you go to the first murdered Polish president after the independence, you're going to see how important is the problem who voted for you. The votes are not equally, they're not equal. And I do believe this is really important because in a moment in which you have a shrinking population, you have a much more movement of people and migration in general, particularly in Europe. What kind of people governments are going to elect is becoming the major reason basically for who people want to elect as a government. And here you have two different kinds of a concept. And this liberal concept basically is quite well known. And the liberal concept is, listen, we go for citizenship. The cultural rights of the majority should be very much protected in the constitution. It goes through the language test. It goes through certain type of values stories, but we keep the political community open. And we're going to be ready to give citizenship to different people to the extent that they're going to contribute to the economy and they're going to be part of this life. And on the other side, the idea is that in a certain way, we're going to open the economy, but we're not going to open the body politics. And to be honest, both choices has very important political problems within it. I'm not making a value judgment who is going to do it better on this, but the major difference between, in a certain way, liberal and conservative is a metaphor and example that I want to use. There is a restaurant in Vienna that we used to go, and this restaurant in Vienna was started as an Italian restaurant, but then the Egyptian guy bought the restaurant, and now the cook, the waiters, the owner, nobody is an Italian. Nobody has ever been in Italy, and nobody speaks Italian. But the menu is in Italian, the wine is the Italian, and the music is in Italian. So is this an Italian restaurant? And from this point of view, basically the liberal answer is, if the menu is in Italian, this is an Italian restaurant. And I do believe that part of the conservative answer is, if Italians do not feel at home in this restaurant, this is not an Italian restaurant. But this is type of issues that we are facing, and we are facing not simply because post-Cold Order is in crisis, but because in a certain way the nation states cannot easily function as an alternative to this. I very much understand the logic of the civilizational states, but can any states be a civilizational state? How many civilizational states you can have in Europe? Is Europe one civilizational state, or basically every nation state is a civilizational state? And from this point of view, even the choices that we're talking about, what kind of people, this is at the heart of the Israelis' dilemma. You have a growing Arab populations on the level of the citizenship, and whose states it is, and whose democracy it is. And from this point of view, this is quite important, and I do believe the democratic nature of our world is making these dilemmas even sharper, because in democracy, numbers count. Normally, we tell the story that government change when people are changing their minds, but also government change when the nature and the composition of the population changes. And in my view, this is part of the story. And here comes the idea of history and memory. Because can you create a historical narrative that is going to be equally attractive? Is this be a story in which political identity is also very much based on a history that targets a certain future, or basically simply remembering certain past? For me, these all open questions, but as I said in the beginning, it is exactly this moment in which governments decide to elect their people, basically trying to include and exclude dramatically in the political community. This is what we're going to see as the populist moment, not just certain type of parties. This is the type of questions, and the question is, who are the people?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thanks so much. We don't actually have that much time as I wish we had. And there is one very interesting question waiting on the table from the audience. But I will move quickly to the third question, which is explicitly about, we've been talking about it already, but this one will be explicitly about narrating European history. If you know the question already, but I will read it to our audiences. If you were a curator of the main historical exhibit at the House of European History in Brussels, and you were to change or add one element of the historical narrative there, what would that be? And I planned that Ivan would speak as the first one now. Is it okay for you? I wanted to reverse these turns so that it's politically better represented.
No, thank you very much. And listen, it's very difficult for me to imagine myself as the curator of the House of European History, because this is really a tough job. And I was in the museum just 2 weeks ago for something. And then you realize that in a certain way, you're making a museum of a concept. And one of the stories that everybody should feel included, at the same time, many of the tensions should not be present. This kind of a version of European history, in my view, have been best captured by a Bulgarian artist who created a certain type of a visual product. And his composition is the following. He took all the famous statues of important European political leaders on horses. And you can find this all over Europe, starting basically with Frederick the Great in Germany. So he simply took the people and only the horses remain. Because he said only the horses are non-controversial. All others basically are going to, all others are going basically to hurt the sensitivity of somebody. My understanding of European history is that European history cannot be constructed as simply protecting the sensitivity of every member state. But just the opposite, it should basically be allowed in the way to see to what extent the commonality of Europe suddenly comes exactly from the fact that we don't share the same reading of history. From this sanitizing history, from all the things that basically divide us, is not going to help. And it is not going to help because then everybody is going to focus on the absences. Then every nation state is going to try to come with their version of this. Listen, there was quite a lot of contradictions. There was many things on which Europeans have been fighting. And one of the interesting things that I read about Europe was that there was a moment in which Europe was very powerful, particularly 19th century, the moment of European empires. And there was a moment in which Europeans learned to cooperate, and this was after World War II. The problem is that now European Union is facing the task how to try to be powerful and to cooperate at the same time. and this is not easy. And from this point of view, we do not need the past simply to tell us that Europe was already there before, but also to try to imagine what kind of choices we have. There is a very beautiful novel recently published by a Bulgarian fiction writer who is facing the problem of European Union and what we're doing now. We have this crisis of the future. And the plot of the novel is the following. The European leaders meet and they cannot agree on the future. So they decided if this is the case, we should agree on the past. So in every country, there is organized a referendum in which part of the 20th century you want to go back. And of course, this is very interesting, and this is a kind of a beautiful story, but I was trying to ask myself, imagine that you really are going to have such a referendums, and every European should agree on one single year in which we want to go back, all of us together, of 20th century, which is this year. And for myself, and I don't know, are you going to agree? I was going back, and paradoxically, 1989 is the only year on which everybody is going to agree. Because in a certain way, in 1989, the idea of Europe was open to everybody. Everybody has his idea of Europe coming, of unified Europe. And from this point of view, if I was paradoxically, the curator of the museum, I was going to start from 1989, but going back and forth in a certain way, not following simply the chronology, but starting from the fact in which probably if we had this referendum, we can agree that 1989 was the year in which both conservatives and liberals and leftists and anybody can go together, because everybody was sure that it was their Europe that was coming into being.
Thank you very much. An excellent idea for the curators, future European museums. And now, Marek Cichocki.
Well, I think I have two problems with this museum and this exposition. The first one, which is the smallest, I think, is that of course. This exposition is to celebrate the European Union. So European Union, European Parliament has established institutions which should celebrate the European Union. So this is the approach to the past and to the history, which was traditionally very strong present in the case of different nation states, creating their own vision of history, celebrating itself. Yes, but there is also another problem I have, and I have already mentioned it. Namely, the problem is that this vision of history, which is illustrated by this exposition, belongs, in my understanding, to the memory culture, which is the product of the idea of the end of the history.
Mm-hmm.
And as I said, I think this is over. And my question is how to make. It doesn't mean that we should close this museum and other institutions, but thanks God, yes. But it means that we have to make the effort to think about how to make this memory culture fit to the new realities, to the new situation, which means that something new is coming. And in the case of Europe, I think this new is the question whether the European Union will be capable of transform itself into a certain entity capable of competing with other entities. We can call it civilization states, or we can use another term. But I think it is rather clear what I mean by that. The question is whether European Union, whether Europe can be transformed in a new kind of entity capable to take this kind of new competition which comes to us in future. And I agree, of course, that this means a lot of problems. What to do with different European cultures, identities, experiences, and so on and so forth. How to represent them in the European identity, in the European political system, and so on and so forth. One point, and this is the last one, I think is, however, decisive to me, and I think we should to keep in mind this problem, because this problem is also related to this exhibition in Brussels. I think looking into future and thinking about how to transform Europe or not in something new, we have to keep in mind that we have a real division of experiences in Europe, which still matters. Because the Western societies look at the current crisis and the whole possible transformation of the order in Europe through the prism of the certain evolution of Western liberalism. Yes, after the Second World War till now. And this is one word of experience we have in Europe, but there is another also. This is the experience of the societies of our part of Europe. And I think that still, despite of the fact that 3 decades are passed after 1989, still I think that these societies look at the current crisis much more through the prism of the experience of the communism. And I think we will not come to any fruitful conclusion in Europe if we don't keep in mind the existence of these 2 different worlds of experience, and if we don't try to look for possibilities to somehow find ways to communicate with each other about these 2 kind of worlds of experience we have in Europe.
Thank you very much. I would even dare to say that there might be more than 2 different European. From our East European perspective, there is 2.
Absolutely.
But what about the Spanish Civil War as a different historical experience? Unfortunately and fortunately, we have not much time and questions are piling. And they are really good. So I will have to decide in chronological order as they were coming to us. First question, can climate change be the common adder for a new kind of global memory culture framework that could replace the post-war Eurocentric world order so as to fit better for an accelerating, fragmenting, and uncertain world? What do you think about that? And who does want to say something? Ivan?
Yeah, very briefly. Listen, there is something extremely interesting for sure about climate. And one of the stories that climate can be very local. Because listen, when we talk about climate change as a global issue, but for many people, this is the places in which they live. This is basically the environment that they know best. So from this point of view, climate is not such a clear left-right divide as many people basically claim to say. And on the other side, being a global issue, the fact that nevertheless of what Europe is doing, if we're just doing on our own, of course, this is not going to change climate. For sure, is a very important part of it. And this is the way that is probably going to change memories. Don't forget that any type of crisis like this is pushing us to remember things that we have forgotten. The pandemic came, and now we all are experts on the Spanish flu. But I was always giving this example, nevertheless, that there were probably 2 times more people that died because of the Spanish flu compared to the World War I. There are 80 times less books being written about the Spanish flu than about World War I. And this is interesting to see how and there. So from this point of view, climate is going to change probably the way we're also telling our story. This is going to be much more about people and land being told differently. Is it going to be enough to create this type of a new identity? I don't know, to be honestly speaking, because climate and climate policy is not as consensual as people pretend them to be. Because in a certain way, everything that we all agree that climate is a big issue, what we're going to start to disagree is who should do this or that about this, who are going to be the winners, who are going to be the losers. And the biggest, of course, issue about climate change is who has the right to change your way of life.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you.
Just briefly, I think we have 2 things, climate change and climate policies, which means a huge political and social change. Mm-hmm. And I think the second issue can have an immense impact on Europe, for example. Mm-hmm. And this impact can be either integrating us, but I think there is also another option, quite possible, disintegrating us. So I think this is something very important, and that is why I made at the beginning this resemblance to the second industrial revolution, because I really believe that that technologies, the transition of technologies, and climate policies have this huge impact of social and political integration or disintegration, especially in case of Europe, but also between different parts of the world as well.
Thank you. And another question relates to what you said. China is the elephant in the room, but the audience wants to know what is meant by this comment. And well, you said it.
China. I mean China, of course. Which is obviously the greatest competitor, and why this is the elephant, because of the strength of the capacities of China, impact of China of Europe, of other parts of world, especially on United States, and with United States on Europe. So China is surely an incentive pushing us into the future. And obviously, I think that China is a very important factor triggering that process of history coming back.
And that we should speak more about it, I guess, since you called it the elephant in the room, yes? Okay, and the question now from Joanna Wawrzyniak, the chair of the program committee of this conference. Thank you for this interesting discussion. Considering yesterday keynote lecture by Olivier Hotel, I would like to ask both speakers on their view on the current decolonization wave. Does it have, in your view, any relevance in Eastern Europe? If yes, what kind of relevance? Ivan?
Let me start, because this is really an interesting issue, because we're talking about different divides in Europe. And by the way, the most important divide in political terms, if you see to the attitudes and the voting pattern, is not between the East and West, and is not between the South and North, but this is between the big metropolitan areas and the other parts of the countries. From this point of view, if you see basically all the surveys, how people basically go on different type of issues, you're going to see that probably the difference between Warsaw and Budapest or Sofia and some of the other parts of the countries are going to be much bigger, the divide, than what you're going to see just between, for example, Germany and Poland. I'm saying this because the interesting story about decolonization is that Europe is composed of two different types of states: former colonial empires and former nation states that basically came up as the first de facto decolonization, basically the disintegration of the continental empires, the Habsburgs, partially the Russians and the Ottomans. And from this point of view, for East Europeans, there is no colonial guilt. In a certain way, it's going to be very difficult, basically, to push a Bulgaria had been part of Ottoman Empire till 1878, to try to have the feeling that we had been transforming others, and basically there was the assumption that we had been in a superiority position of this. In my view, this is the chance for Europe. Because in a certain way, the legacy of the European empires is there. It's quite important. And of course, this is going to become more and more important when much bigger part of the population of the world is going to live outside of Europe, where a much bigger part of the GDP of the world is going to be produced outside of Europe. And then at the same time, I do believe that Europe has its own kind of anti-colonial sensitivity, and this anti-colonial sensitivity very much comes from the East. This is interesting because when we're talking about colonial civilizational states, and Marek was giving the reference to Russia and Turkey, and to a certain extent, I do believe China is a different story. This is the most interesting story because Russia and Turkey both have been peripheral empires. At the same time, they basically very much also believe that they have been treated as a colonies in one or the other part of it. And this kind of ambiguity about your own imperial nature is something that is so strong in their kind of a national identity, and this is why the civilizational identity they're pushing for. But I agree with also in the fact that decolonization discourse is going to be important for Europe, also to the fact that a lot of people coming outside of Europe, and particularly in Western Europe, and you can see this strongly in France, you can see it in Germany, that have been part of the former French or other colonies or Belgian colonies, are living in these countries. And this discourse is going to be there because these people are there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Would you like to add something to that question?
Maybe one point, because I of course I understand it, especially now, this discourse about colonization, decolonization is very important in the Western societies, and also in a Western politics and academia. Also in a relation to the very interesting issue of reparations, for example, and so this. But I remember Hannah Arendt.
You mean the Polish claims for reparations from Germany related to World War II?
I mean different claims, which come also from countries from Africa.
Okay.
So, because of this period of the colonization in the 19th century, But I remember Hannah Arendt's book on totalitarianism, where she tried aptly, I think, to present imperialism. Of course, she was very strongly influenced by the old book about imperialism by John Hobson, and so on and so forth. And also, she was also influenced very strongly by the Marxist view on what imperialism was. But I remember that she very aptly described imperialism in Europe of 19th century as the preparation to what has happened then later in the 20th century caused by totalitarian regimes. So she understood imperialism as a preparation phase to totalitarian regimes. And I remember also that she tried to describe imperialism in these two veins. I mean, on the one hand, this was overseas imperialism and which was mostly linked to colonialism. But she also tried to describe the continental colonization and colonialism in Europe. And this includes our part of Europe, because the obviously terrain of the continental colonialism was Central and Eastern and Southeastern Europe too. Yes. There is, I think, this case of Hannah Arendt shows that there is the approach which enables us to look at these two types of colonialism together, maybe not separately, as something as sometimes it happens.
Yeah, and it is developing today, actually, in scholarship to look at the totalitarianism. Nazism with reference to the colonialism. Thank you very much. And the question, well, maybe I will ask the audience here if you have. Would you like to ask a question too? Then there is one last question that we have from the audience, and 3 to 4 minutes left. From Toyn Jansen: could a more permanent digital deliberative democracy be the answer to the problem of majority-minority in parliamentary 4-year election cycle democracies during a time of such acceleration and fragmentation that you sketch? I guess it refers to what Ivan Krastev said.
Listen, this is an interesting question, but it is very difficult to imagine the idea of democracy without the idea of the majority. I mean, electoral majority that comes as a result of the elections. And this is quite important because if you go back to the idea of democracy coming from such a strong anti-totalitarian school, like people like Claude Lefort, very much impressed by the French Revolution, he said, what is democracy? Democracy is a political regime that is keeping the place of power empty. So while the monarch can basically represent and embody the nation, in democracy, nobody can do it. In a certain way, democracy is basically never allowing the majority to become a permanent majority. But even if you go on a deliberative, and I do believe that certain level of digital deliberarization and so on can change democratic politics a lot, and you're already seeing basically how people are reacting, the biggest problem is, can you have a democracy in which you do not have an idea who is in power? And I do believe this is an interesting issue, and I'm going to ask my 30 seconds. to tell a story of a science fiction story by Isaac Asimov, who was telling about the election. It was written in 1952, and he was talking how the elections in the United States were taking place in 2008. By the way, Obama was elected. So he said the technologies are going to be so well developed that basically we'll know where the preferences of the people, but we're just going to choose one undecided voters, and we're going to talk to him to see the intensity of his feeling. This is exactly, in a certain way, democracy in which nobody can celebrate on the election night. But I'm not sure that this type of a democracy is going to solve part of the problems, particularly keeping in mind that one of the major crises of democracies today is that many people believe that we vote, but we are not sure that people that we elect are really the people who govern.
Yeah. And this is populism, the rise of populism again. Thank you. Would you like to add something?
Oh, it's a perfect.
Thank you both very much for being here, for contributing to this up-to-date and important to our audiences and to me very much discussion about Europe. My impression is that it was not a dual, parallel voices, that you speak so much to each other. It was more a dialogue between the two of you. You are referencing your works when speaking, and maybe also a pattern for the European dialogue that is missing today. And with this beautiful thought, I would like to thank you very much. Thank you to the audience present here. Thank you to the audiences present before your computers. And see you at other sessions during the MSA conference. Thank you very much again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.